G'day and welcome to The Good Sources, not Q&A show. I'm Dave Pellowe, your host for this evening, and pleasure to be back. And it was also great to have Lyle hosting for us last week, along with Alexandra Marshall and James McPherson, taking care of things. I was, of course, getting ready for the Church and State Summit, which was an astounding success. That all went remarkably well. Well, it's good to be with you tonight, and later on this evening we will be joined by the Member of Parliament in Queensland for the very, very large electorate of Traeger, Robbie Katter, and we'll be talking about some of the ideas that he has and has been sharing on their Facebook page recently, as well as lots of other issues. But joining me in the studio tonight is Damian Coory. Fantastic to finally get you under the hot lights, Damian.
It's nice to be here. It's nice to be here in person and not down the wire.
I know, you're much higher resolution in real life.
Yes, most of us are. How was the Church and State conference? Were you happy with it?
I was ecstatic with it.
Good.
And the reason I was ecstatic with it, and this could sound like lip service, but I'm 100% sincere, to the point of marveling. I had very little to do with it. It felt entirely God blessed.
Oh, that's good.
Everybody, there was an ease to everything.
Yeah.
It just worked. We were deliberately smaller this year than last year, and it was still sold out. We couldn't give people enough seats because we were choosing to make it small, and a record number of people watched online. But there was just a coordination between the whole event, which I couldn't have
felt like.
I couldn't have managed. It was too coordinated for me. And again, I'm not being falsely modest. It was literally just, you know what it is? It's credit to the teamwork spirit, the teamwork of Christians from various denominations. And various political parties. There were former Labor members there who were just loving it. But the best part was that the arc of conversation from all of the speakers was always honouring God, came from a whole heap of various denominations and parties again, and political spectrum. But again, just it was clear there was a uniform theme and trajectory for the whole conference, which was essentially that we need to have courage. But one of the other speakers joining us on the panel tonight is David Ould, who was also one of the speakers at last weekend's Church and State Summit. David, welcome to Not Q&A.
Hi, Dave. Thanks so much for having me on. Hello, Damian. Good to see you as well.
How are you?
Now, for the record, gentlemen, I'll be Dave. He can be David, so we can clarify who's who in the zoo. David, your topic, I don't want to talk about the summit forever.
Sure.
We'll be releasing, it's just not on the agenda tonight, but you were one of the favourite topics at the summit, because you were talking about what to do when your church is embracing false teaching. And you actually surprised me a lot. One of the reasons I invited you was because you've encountered this and stayed. And I didn't necessarily want somebody who's going to say burn the place down, which you certainly didn't.
I've had my moments, though. I've had my moments, Dave.
You really did come out strong. You really, I think one of the profound things I took away from it was you said the pulpit has all the power, not the pew. And so when it comes to setting the culture or changing the culture of what's being taught there, that was all in the power of the person preaching.
Yeah. So look, it was said to me a long time ago by a guy I trained with in London, and I think it's certainly the evidence around us is that the churches, denominations that have gone downhill from the pulpit. And where you see churches that are restored, that are brought back to great health, to genuine Christian gospel believing health, it's from the pulpit again. And so just that word of, I think, just realism and caution to people as they're frustrated. One of the things I told the summit was one of the regular messaging I'm getting is from people who've been in parishes or churches for years, and then they just go, what do I do here? The new minister's a complete fruit bat, just teaching all sorts of nonsense and allowing this kind of just garbage to go on. What do I do? And I'm regularly having to say, there are things you can do, but ultimately you need to be realistic about what's going on. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, how do you I wasn't there, of course. I was unable to do this year, but what was the issue for you, David, that arose in your Church of England? Yeah.
Sure. So I'm an Anglican, so originally Church of England back in England, and now ordained in the Anglican Church of Australia here. So look, the issue that most denominations are grappling with at the moment, the presenting issue is sexual morality and sexual ethics, and so obviously questions around homosexuality, and then some related questions around gender identity. What's really going on, of course, is that underneath it's really about where authority is in the church. Is it really in the Bible? Does God speak to his church and rule his church through the Bible, properly read and understood, or are there other sources of authority, and are there people who are paying lip service to the Bible? So that works its way out in various different ways in different generations. Our current presenting issue is the sex mad culture around us, making us ask questions that we would never have asked before, and coming up with answers that the church would never have come up with before. So that's the main issue for us.
Right. Yeah.
I think that leads us nicely into the topic of the week and weekend, and that is the rape allegations made against our federal treasurer. Now, he has been accused of a rape in 1988 when he was 17 years old, and tragically, the young lady who made that allegation passed away from suicide last year. The day after, she told police she no longer wanted to proceed with making the complaint. Now this is tragic, and one of the things that I'm actually most aware of right now is how fragile Christian Porter is looking. I think it's entirely likely that if innocent, and he's entitled to the presumption of innocence, which is a facet of this topic we need to get to, but if innocent, this public witch trial, this public show trial, it's not trial by media, it's actually trial by Twitter and media just piling on late. It's actually it's not at all unlikely, and we should be very careful that we're not giving ammunition. I don't know how to phrase this more carefully or accurately, but I want to be careful that the media isn't creating another death from suicide because of the absolute harassment and persecution of a man who's entitled to be presumed innocent until proven otherwise. A man whose case the police have said there's no case to answer, and yet we're seeing people insist that because the police have said there's no case to answer, there's no admissible evidence that can be proceeded upon, that they're after a different trial because apparently the rule of law isn't enough for them. They need the rule of Twitter or the rule of media trials, as if the police are incompetent or unwilling to do a professional and thorough investigation to the requisite standards of justice. That is truly worrying. Damian?
It is, yeah. I mean, one of the most disturbing things that I heard yesterday was one of the reporters saying that you haven't answered to the court of public opinion. Now, the idea of the court of public opinion in public relations terms is the way that we frame the environment that you're in when you've got to go forward and you've got to put your case. And we use that analogy. We say it's like a court. You're going to be evaluated, but it's not a real court. You don't stand there and say you've got to meet the court of public opinion, as if it's some, sound and functional legal entity. It isn't. The court of public opinion is grossly irrational, highly over-emotional and very, very unreliable. It's the court of mob rule, and it's the reason we have real courts, so that we don't require people to put their case in a court of public opinion, because if we did, we'd wind up with, you know, the Salem witch hunts all over again, which is pretty much where we're at right now. So, you know, you say whether if he's guilty or if he's not guilty. I'm just going to say right at the outset that, first of all, we need to put a statute of limitations on rape claims. 33 years is utterly ridiculous.
Of course, there's no
evidence. I think there needs to be a 10-year, maybe a period. But you're dealing with a crime that is already incredibly difficult to prove, even within a couple of weeks of it happening. If someone laid charges a couple of weeks after, it'd be very hard to prove. It's a Category 1 crime, as it should be. It's an incredibly serious offence. And for these reasons, we have to be extra careful, right? Or we'll wind up, you know, with all sorts of horrible results, as we saw with the Pell case.
Lindy Chamberlain,
and are we going to see it again? I mean, it's just it's appalling to me that we are even entertaining a discussion about something that happened so long ago, I'm afraid. And I think we've really, as a society, got to say, look, what's a fair and reasonable period, and put a statute of limitation on crimes like this. Otherwise, anybody could be accused, and literally anybody.
And that's exactly what he had to say in the press conference. Is like, if this is the new standard, we might as well not have an Attorney General. And thank you to Bill Summers, who corrected me. I called him the Treasurer before. Christian Porter's the federal, I called him the Treasurer. He's the Federal Attorney General. Thank you, Bill. And you should have picked me up on that.
I wasn't paying enough attention. Was
Good admission. I had somebody on Twitter today tell me that I wasn't interested in the evidence because I didn't want a public inquiry. And I'm like, well, actually, no, sir. You're the one who's not interested in the evidence, because there is no evidence. The police have looked, they've investigated, and you're looking for evidence which isn't there, which is a lower standard of evidence, because you don't have what you want for your preferred outcome. David,
we haven't even had the presenting of the basic evidence to a magistrate to form see if there's even a prima facie case. So I heard a QC on ABC radio tonight quite bombastically insisting that this was a credible allegation. Now, I did a little research on the QCs, a guy by the name of Jeffrey Watson, and it turns out that he's a pretty, well, he has been criticised in the past for by the Law Council, or one of the law associations, I think the New South Wales one, for saying that he, referring to the bloody Liberal Party during an ICAC proceeding, I think. And so he is somebody who has a political agenda on the ABC, professing that there is this is a credible allegation. Well, what makes a credible allegation? How can an allegation that's 33 years old, and with all due respect to people with mental illness, I mean, this woman had bipolar disorder, and if you know what bipolar disorder is, people swing from states of mania to states of severe depression. Therefore, in a state of mania, there could be some degree of embellishment or aberration in her perception of the past, considering how long ago it was. So I can't see this as credible. Her parents, a lot of people forget, there's been a lot of deliberate reporting, in my view, omitting the very important fact in that letter, which was that her parents quite clearly said that they had repeatedly said to her throughout the years that they didn't think it was wise for her to go to the police because they couldn't be sure that their daughter wouldn't have embellished the story or embellished the situation. And that hasn't really been widely reported. That's quite critical. ABC Radio this afternoon talked about, again, in the interview with Jeffrey Watson, they were talking about the question of whether or not that embellishment, the question of, I've lost my train of thought now. The question of whether or not the family wanted an inquiry to go on. And then I looked at that, I thought, that's interesting. So the family have said that they didn't want the police investigation, but now they're saying they want the parliamentary inquiry into Christian Porter's situation to go ahead. And then I looked it up later, and it turns out that what they were saying was they wanted the police inquiry into the death of their daughter to go ahead in South Australia, not the inquiry into Christian Porter. But nobody on the ABC made that distinction or cleared that up. So that's the latest, as far as I know, where things are at. But it just seems exactly. And this is the thing about media: you've got to listen to what's being left out as well as what's being said. Unfortunately, it's not quite the standard it used to be.
Yep. Nicole Thomas says the audio's improved so much. Well done, Dave. Brett Clark says, here's an idea. If you were a victim of a crime, report it to the police as soon as possible. Yeah. Bill Summers says, so good to hear a balanced and level view on the circus that we saw yesterday. And Pete Ousby, hi Pete, says politicians could always cut taxpayer funding to the ABC. I'd love to see your comments in there. Please share it with your friends. David, tell me your thoughts on what we've said so far, and whether or not I want you to, among your general comments, speak to what Damian mentioned in passing about a statute of limitations. Is there a need for that, do you think? Is that the problem?
Yeah, I'm glad you've raised that, because actually that was something that I wanted to take up and probably take a different view to the one that Damian is espousing. I mean, I join with you guys in generally just being distraught at the whole thing. Not only have you got a young woman who's died, possibly something's gone on in the past that's exacerbated the mental illness that she clearly suffered from, but now you've got, as we've said, this trial by I want to say trial by media. That's part of what's going on. Trial by social media and all the rest of it. And again, I've been one of those saying online that surely the presumption of innocence must be something that we've got to uphold. And I think it's hard, isn't it, when you've got a heinous topic like this, and when these crimes are committed, they're just so awful that we all want to see justice be done, and yet the presumption of innocence, this is a basic principle that we've got. We are prepared to let guilty people go free in order that innocent people are not convicted. That's a basic premise of our legal system, and it does seem that the way that some people are talking really is undermining that. On the statute of limitations, I think I'm going to take a different view. I having worked with a number of people that have been actually had sexual assaults against them and been in that field a little bit. I think the thing we've got to be aware of is that sometimes it takes a long time for people to muster the courage to actually report these things. And while 10 years does feel like a long time, and while in principle we want to go, yeah, if something happens, you ought to go and report it immediately, I think the reality that we've got to face up to is that for some women it takes huge amounts of time. Whole generations often will sometimes pass before they feel ready to address and front up on those things. I would suggest, however, that the things we've also discussed, that the further back in time we are, the even more difficult it is to prove. And it's very difficult to prove anyway, isn't it? Because ultimately a lot of these things do come down to one testimony against another. But I'd say that the period of time between the alleged event and then the reporting of it is its own natural statute of limitations. So the further away it is, the harder it is going to be to demonstrate it. But I would be reluctant to have any limit on it, just given the way that I'm aware that for some women it's really hard. And then of course we should also be aware that we have many cultures now living in Australia where it's doubly hard for them because of cultural stigmas and things about this. I certainly deal with a number of cultures in the church that I deal with in central Sydney, where when a woman is maltreated by a man, large elements of their culture will blame her quite openly. She must have done something wrong. That kind of stuff. So just a word of caution from me there, even as we want to uphold those general principles.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a sensible call, a sensible element in the call for a reduced statute of limitations. In that, I understand where it's coming from, but I'm also familiar with Andrew Evans as the leader of the Family First Party in South Australia, actually removing the statute of limitations for victims of child sexual assault. And many people were able to be brought to justice, satisfying a standard of, a burden of proof. And
I think for child sexual assault, it has to be 20, 30 years, right? It can't be 10 years.
I think it's just removed altogether.
Right.
I don't know that there is any statute there. And I'm with David. I get that maybe even within 10 years, victims of sexual assault, adult or juvenile, may not have recovered enough to be able to go through what amounts to a repeated trauma. Because
if I can just...
the legal process isn't like doing a book report. It's actually reliving over and over again immersively, without the physical experience, the emotional stuff. So I get that, and so I just want to find a point there where we can. I don't think 10 years is it. If there was at least the acknowledgement that the longer it goes, the harder it is to prove, as well as being easier to face. Yeah, go ahead, David.
I wonder if I can just add some weight to that argument. One personal and one institutional. So personally, I've sat with a gentleman in his early 70s who disclosed to me some quite horrific abuse carried out by, I'm ashamed to say, by Anglican ministers, perpetrated against him in his teenage years. And I think I was probably the first person he disclosed that to.
Wow.
So now the ability to get any justice at that point, those people who did those horrible things to him were long gone. But nevertheless, sometimes it just takes that long, and of course the shame for a man in having that done to him by another man, of course, can often exacerbate that. But also when we had the inquiry recently, the Royal Commission into the responses of institutions to child sex abuse, and a lot of us in religious organizations didn't come out of that looking great. One of the things that we did see there is many people who were talking about their abuse as children, which had happened again decades before, and because of the systems around them, they felt no confidence in being able to report those things. And so we were actually seeing people who were being prosecuted for things that had happened many years before. Most famously, of course, the previous dean of the cathedral at Newcastle, who was rightly locked away for some of the horrible things that he and others did to children. So I just want to urge caution. Our experience on matters like this tells us that sometimes people take a long time.
Yeah,
I would accept that as a fair rebuke of my call for a statute of limitations.
Look, Damian, I'll take it that you've not had to sit with as many people in those experiences.
No, I've covered a few long trials.
Fair enough.
Of various people in sexual assault cases and things like that, and I've witnessed. Well, one of them was the trial of a Catholic priest, but it was a situation where there were multiple, accusers. And the other was, there were a couple of them, but I had a former teacher of mine, actually, that I had to sit through his trial.
Wow.
Yeah, quite interesting.
Did you escape unscathed?
Yeah, I did escape unscathed, thankfully. He wasn't my class teacher, but he was a teacher
of... for you?
No, it wasn't actually. Apart from the revolting nature of the evidence, it was okay. But it wasn't related to anything that he did while he was a teacher. He became a psychologist after that and was abusing people in a different circumstance. But,
oh wow!
So I have also seen a young man go through hell, being falsely accused by an overly rabid organization, and that case upset me a lot. Seeing a young man being hauled over the coals for absolutely, he says, she says sort of situation. So I do. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult area. It's incredibly. That's, I think, as David said, there is kind of an inbuilt natural statute of limitations with the period of time that passes, right? That you can't find the evidence or you can't get the evidence.
I think the lesson surely then is that we just need to be careful on both sides, right? We just need to be careful both looking after those who make allegations and caring for them in an appropriate way. And also we do need to again defend this presumption of innocence, and we need to do that even if there may even be some other stuff that's going on around that's circumstantial or whatever that may indicate it. And the elephant in the room is that the previous things have been said about Porter and some of his behaviours being spoken about. I mean, now the ABC think that's now fair game, and so in their reporting on the current issues, they're of course constantly referring back to that they would say, I'm sure, to provide context, but of course it's to flavour the way that things are done. But we want to say, even in those circumstances, yes, he may be a certain type of guy, but that doesn't remove this right that he has to the presumption of innocence, and so we just need to be really careful.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a serious Category 1 crime here. This is rape. This is not
absolutely.
Sexual harassment, as hideous as it is in the workplace, is a slightly different matter. And I do get concerned when I see journalists, and particularly the ABC, trying to frame a discussion with all of this, and it's pretty much what Louise Milligan does quite a lot with her books. I mean, she'll paint a picture, and you're reading this narrative, and then you get the sucker punch of, well, here's the big bit. The Four Corners story last year apparently was supposed to go ahead with the Porter allegations in it. That's why that story, I don't know if you saw it, that Milligan did last year about the culture at Parliament House. When I watched that, I thought, this is an absolute beat up. There's nothing here. There's no there. There's no substance to this. And that's because it was legaled, apparently, I understand from sources close to the production that told me.
For those not in media, legal means
it's been, the lawyers have come in and said you have to take that out.
The lawyers have taken the big risks out of it.
Yeah, so they've taken the guts out of the middle of her Four Corners piece.
Yeah.
And basically left this shell of a story which didn't really play very well. It sounded like a bit of a beat up, trying to say that there's this culture that happens in Canberra, but it just sounded like a bad workplace culture that, you could pick a few cases, you put it together, you could say it was happening almost anywhere. I mean, I think, I'm not saying we don't have a problem in Canberra. I think the problem is booze. We can get onto that later.
Yeah. Look, I want to get onto culture now, because we've got this article here that my attention was drawn to by the younger Turnbull, Daisy. And she's written an article saying that parents must talk to their sons about consent earlier and more explicitly. And as you can imagine, as a family of leftists, she's essentially saying that we need to basically tell boys what rape is, what sexual assault is. And girls need to know this as well, because apparently they don't know when a line's been crossed. And I'm reminded of the pagan, absolute idolatrous pagan culture that Israel was before God led them out of Egypt. And then he gave them the book of Leviticus with instructions like, it's a bad idea to sleep with your father's wife. And just other things which should have been really fundamental. So that was obviously a pre-Christian nation. And I'm wondering what Daisy Turnbull's family was like, what her brother was like. Because in my family, teaching my sons what consent means is entirely insulting. It's a complete exercise in redundancy. What I've taught them is you don't have sex outside marriage. Even if the girl's begging you for it, you don't do it. You don't get drunk. You never drink to a point where you're lacking inhibition or self-control. You don't be in compromised situations with members of the opposite sex. You don't let your friends do that either. And so I'm wondering, if you need to teach your sons what consent means, then this is probably a really good indicator that the progressive sexual ethic has debased so far that you now need to train your children basic understanding as if they were dogs who are unable to control their animal urges, and they need to be trained in the very fundamentals like sit, fetch, and stay, and don't rape. This is absolutely an indictment on the progressive sexual ethic, which started in the 60s with free love, progressed in the 70s with divorce on demand, and now you have to teach your sons not to rape women. Well, shame on you if that's the culture and you need to teach your sons not to rape. How about we return to the Christian values which made Australia a safe place to be a woman and to raise sons, where we actually respect women, where we treat people not as sacks of meat to be consumed, but as people with not just a body, but a soul and a spirit as well. And loving them means embracing every part of their being and not just one part of their being. Daisy Turnbull said, and she quoted Mia Friedman, said, what we need to do is to teach our sons to hold back a girl's hair when she's sick instead of taking advantage of her. I'm like, why is your son or your daughter in that situation? Here's the problem. My kids would never be there. Like, don't take advantage of a girl when she's drunk. What are you doing with a girl who's drunk? She's far nowhere near good enough for you.
Well, if you're doing anything with a girl who's drunk, you need to be looking after her and making sure she's safe, which is what we did in my day. You know, you'd be taking her and protecting her from any risk. Sorry, David.
Or how about 3 drinks previously actually manning up and doing what men are meant to do, which is to, with great care, look after the women around them. I hope that's not patronizing. It's patronizing or anything, but it's just you know what men are meant to be. And actually say, do you know what? I wonder if you might want to have a glass of water now instead. I mean, I think the problem with what's been said here, just the consent thing obviously is an important issue, right? And our kids were actually had it. My teenage boy had it at his Christian school just a couple of weeks ago. I was actually pleased to see that they're addressing that. But to say that that's it in the way that she said it is actually hopelessly reductionistic, because it's not getting what's really going on, which is that actually, here's what I do with I've got 3 kids, 1 teenage boy, 1 teenage girl. With my teenage boy, what I'm doing is I'm teaching him what being a man is about. I'm teaching him about what I actually say to him, and then hopefully by the way he sees me treat his mother and his sister, I'm going, as men, our job is to look after and care for the women who are in our lives, and we have various degrees of responsibility, but we have a generic responsibility as men towards women, because they are different to us and they are in many ways more vulnerable than us, and that's just your job as a man. Now I want to get you to man up and do that, of which of course consent then is just a given, right? The issues of consent are just a given, but they come within a much bigger package. But what we've got a whole generation that's been raised a different way. They've got everything in the media telling them lots and lots of different things. They're told the whole idea that men have particular roles in respect to women is abhorrent and patriarchal and the rest of it. And then we're surprised, after we've fed them a whole bunch of porn as well, where all these women are sexual objects and willing all the time, then they're surprised that they behave in these ways, because young teenage boys are coursing with hormones, and give them a few drinks and I'm afraid they do dumb stuff, and which is appalling, right? But they're doing it because there's no framework around them to help them, to guide them through those very, very important years.
I think if we take that, the very strict conservative position that you take as a conservative Christian, and we
sorry to correct you, I'm just trying to be Christian, not conservative.
No, I get it. Whether Leviticus is my favorite book of the Bible, we can talk about that later. But
hey, it's great if you're coming out of 400 years of slavery in a pagan culture.
Fair enough. I would just say that I think that,
or feminism,
we have a problem. We have deeper cultural problems, right? And I think feminism went off the rails to a certain extent, and we've now said to boys, look, you don't have any place taking care of women. I said in the podcast this week that the genders are equal, but they are different. And even though we might be moving away from typical gender norms of the past, we can't wipe away thousands and thousands of years of evolution and what God has intended for us, as obviously in our physicality and in our thinking. And I think there is a very strong case to be made that men are supposed to take care of women. And what I find interesting in the work of Jordan Peterson highlights this a lot, which I think is fantastic, that men need to be able to feel a sense of heroism.
Absolutely.
The right word?
Absolutely.
And so when you say to young men, and Jordan Peterson's made this point a number of times, when you say to a young man, listen, fella, you go out there and you take care of the women around you. You be the one guy in the room who says to the other guys in the room, that's not cool, right? And I'm not talking about it in the patronizing way that the modern feminists do about, stand up and say, intervene and that sort of thing. But being a real man,
not an ally,
not an ally,
be a man,
be a man,
yeah,
man up. And we have to get back to that. We have to get back to, we seem to have gone through the "it's okay to cry if you're a man" phase. Now I think we need to maybe say it's also okay to have some stoicism. And stoicism is an interesting philosophy that perhaps we should reflect on a little bit as well. And I hope we're going to start to see a shift, because when you give young boys this idea of this aspirational idea of what it means to be a good man, a good soldier, a good warrior, a good protector, you see them just light up. I don't know if you see that in your work, David, but that was what Jordan Peterson was saying, that young men need a sense of purpose. They need a sense of manhood, and if you give it to them, they'll take it.
I certainly do see that in my work. In the place where I was before my current role, I was a rector in Macquarie Fields, which is right in the southwest of Sydney, and one of the areas of real social disadvantage in Sydney. And the church that I was at had an on-site charity called Break the Cycle Glen Quarry, and part of what they did is there was an on-site chaplain who did a lot of anti-recidivism work, and he worked with men who were at various levels of engagement in the criminal justice system. That's a polite way of putting it. And he developed this course called Sorted, which was a 13-week course that guys would sit down with, some of them because their parole officers sent them there. And these guys were thinking through for the first time what it means to be men. And they'd grown up in a culture where for a generation they had been frankly neutered. And it shocked the way that the sexual revolution had worked out in these far more disadvantaged working class areas. Now, if you're sitting in your apartment in, I don't know, on the harbour in Sydney, sipping your Chardonnay, watching the Queen Mary steam into the harbour, you're probably doing a great job, and actually your situation actually in some sense protects you and barricades you from the effects of the crazy sexual revolution that's going on. You can afford to talk about free love and the separation of sex and marriage and all those kinds of things, because you've got some protection against it. But I tell you what, I went out Southwest and I spent years there with people where they were also told, doesn't matter who you sleep with, don't worry about being a dad and looking after kids and all that kind of stuff, and with no protection around them, with no middle class restraint, with no just the protection that a good income and your status in life brings you. There was absolute carnage in households, and then those men who'd been raised or not raised, as it were, in those environments, then were themselves often not raising children. And it was awful. And all of a sudden you see why you've got generations of men who are just messing up because their dads were told not to do what came naturally to them, and then they didn't even know what to do with their own children. And here we are. So yeah, I want to go teaching kids about consent. Well, of course, that's a proper thing to teach about, but it's just hopelessly reductionistic. It is. If you don't take the whole package, you just can't take one little bit of it and think it's going to work.
Yeah, excellent. Look, I agree. We need to, I guess, talk to the people. We need to deal with the reality of where we're at, and that is a culture where young men and young women have been taught to behave like animals, and that it's okay to behave like animals. And now we need to train them like animals in basic behavior.
It's interesting.
But nevertheless, I don't need to teach my sons about consent, because they're never, if they follow my advice, going to be in a situation where they don't have a wedding ring on with the person that they're engaging with. Like, and wedding ring doesn't mean you get to rape your wife. I don't want anybody to construe that. And trust me, people are stupid enough to think I might say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what I am saying is a really great quote, actually, really great pearl of wisdom from Robin Hood, Men in Tights. No ring, no ding-a-ling. So that would solve a lot of the problems. Joe Biden, no ring, no ding-a-ling. Her chaperone, the maid, the nanny or whatever that Maid Marian had.
I think we've just got to get the sexual culture back. Look, and where to let's face it, right? I don't think as religious, I'm not hugely real. I'm a practicing Catholic, but I think we've done a pretty bad job. And I'd be interested to hear what David says about this, because I'd like to see what it's like from the perspective of the church. But I think we've generally done a pretty bad job of dealing with the church is not great with human sexuality. I think there are urges, there are issues, there's the question of homosexuality, there's the question of all sorts of different types of, there are people who are born with, who are genuinely transsexual, or and I don't think as a
transsexual, you mean intersex?
Intersex. Sorry, I'm not up with the latest specific terms like you are.
Definitions are super important.
I really try to ignore sexual politics as much as I can, but it's not easy. But I think that there
is a statistical occurrence of biological abnormalities called intersex.
Right, there is, and
which isn't a sin or immorality. It's like a cleft palate. It's something that needs correction and compassion.
Okay, so if I guess what I'm saying is, we haven't collectively dealt with these issues. We've been very strong. I think the church has been very kind of, this is it, that's it, I think society and culture has said, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't seem reasonable. And I think to a certain degree, some of that is okay. What I think we're in a state where I think we've gone now is we've gone so far to this extreme of sexual liberation and being sex positive and all of that sort of thing, that we are really, music videos are pornography now. They are pornography.
They are.
And when you said a piece of meat, I thought, or animal behavior, I thought to myself, oh, that's a bit much. And then I thought, no, if you have a look at Cardi B's last 2 video clips, it is animal behavior. It's animals. And there is no sense of a connection between your sexuality and your and respect for the other person and love for the other person. So even if we are not going to go right back to saying, absolutely no sex before marriage, although I honor anybody who has that value, you have every right to have that perspective. But even if we didn't go that far back, we've got to at least let's just get the culture back to, we don't jump into bed with everybody we feel like having to, at the drop of a hat. And I would like to think that this isn't happening. But my concern is that and again, I'm a little out of touch because I've been away for a while, but my concern is that in Australian culture, in the teenage environment now, the respect for sex as an extension of an expression of love and a spiritual connection is lost. And it's almost taboo to even suggest that. And the sex education in schools today is all biological in the extreme. I'm not saying the British system where my kids were going last year. I couldn't believe some of the stuff that they were being taught.
Yeah.
And we've kind of lost that completely. So I'd just like to see it come back, halfway even would make me a lot happier as a parent of 2 teenage girls. I just think we've fallen off a cliff somewhere.
Yeah, and here's the entire attack on family in various aspects, which include the pill and abortion on demand and government-funded childcare, as well as sexual promiscuity. We've lost the value of motherhood. We, as a society, don't. It's common for a woman who chooses to be a stay-at-home mum to feel looked down upon or less than, even if it's not actively said, and that's a tragedy. It's common for people who choose to be faithful to one person for their whole life and wait until sex to be looked at as if they're abnormal. And yeah, I'm right with you. It would be fantastic if we could come back at least halfway to the point where sexual promiscuity wasn't celebrated as if that was a virtue. Like, let's just call it for what it is. It's promiscuity. It's not the ideal way of doing things. I agree with you. Religion shouldn't condemn people because they've sinned to the point that we write them off and devalue them another way.
Yes, which is a lot of what we did in the Catholic Church in the 1950s and 60s.
And every other church. You know, we've got to progress from that to the same point.
And that's why the pews are empty in the Catholic Church now, I believe, firmly.
And you know what? Here's what Jesus said to that. He said to the woman caught in sexual immorality, I don't condemn you to death, which was the context, but stop it. Go and sin no more. And so if we in the church can say, hey, look, this isn't the best for you, and I'm telling you this because I love you, not because I want to see you killed, condemned, executed for the crime. And so it's just not best for you. And clearly it's going to come back and bite you potentially up to 33 years later. This is really, really stupid roll of the dice. And you know what's not? Is following the manufacturer's instructions. And again, I'm just saying this is a better way to raise your children than to teach them what consent means, which assumes the worst of your children. And I think when that's your parenting assumption, they'll live up to your expectations.
Sometimes I think, and I remember going back to when I was younger, we used to say, oh, you get the really conservative Christian schools or the non-co-ed schools were where you got all the teen pregnancies, because it was so taboo to even discuss sexual matters that kids were behaving sexually in an irresponsible way when they did get mix the sexes. I went to Brisbane State High, which was a co-ed school after I left the Catholic education system, and I found the kids there to be much more mature and well developed in terms of engaging with each other, and it seemed to be a healthier environment to me. So I don't know. It's a tough one, that one, because I think sometimes that extreme, if we're too extreme, maybe we get a counter reaction that's like,
look,
you're dealing with teenage hormones. You've got to say.
I wouldn't want it to be extreme, but I also think there comes a point where you have to say, drive the car forwards, not sideways.
Sure.
This isn't to destroy your fun; it's to enhance your enjoyment,
and
safety, and longevity of enjoyment of this great toy God's given you.
Well, Dave, maybe I can take your illustration and just bend it in a slightly different way. I think it's not so much a matter of saying drive the car in a certain direction. I think it's more a matter of we've just not got to be afraid to say, let's sit down and really talk about how cars work. So you can really get the maximum enjoyment out of it. Now, Damian's original question was, as churches, have we got this wrong? Staggeringly so, along with let's just face it as well, much of society. Human beings are always more likely just to like a nice rule than to grapple with the nuances of principles and working that out. And so especially if you're quite conservative, then it's much easier just to go, don't do that. And just to help you out, we're not going to talk about it either. And that can be because we genuinely want to protect people from bad things. It can also be because we're quite embarrassed ourselves and don't know how to grapple with a topic. And so the Christian position has ended up being, even amongst what I thought was quite sensible evangelical churches that certainly I was in my 20s, is thou shalt not. And then when you get married, thou shalt, and with great abandon and with great enjoyment. And so it's kind of true, but it just doesn't grapple with the complexities of it. And so actually what we want to be doing, I think, from early age is teaching our kids to understand sexuality in a way that's appropriate to them. And then as they keep getting older, keep addressing those things and do it. And I'm with you on this, Dave. Obviously, I'm the Christian minister in the room, but do it in a way that draws upon the truth from the God who made us. Now, what is great about that truth, and I've been working on some material recently with a lady called Patricia Weiraccoon, who's a sexologist, a Christian lady.
Lovely lady.
Great speaker. She's a member of our church, and we're working on some material together for distribution. What's great is to see that actually the biblical principles, the biblical description of what we're like marries up, every pun intended, marries up very, very well with the best scientific research that we have, with what the biology tells us, from everything about the distinctions between the genders and how they are. There are only two genders and how they work, down to stuff about sexual response cycles and stuff. Actually, if you look at the way the Bible says that men ought to be relating to women and vice versa, you can actually see it's actually consistent with the biological understanding of how those things work and so on. So actually, we're one of those crazy sets of parents where we did sex ed ridiculously early with our kids. So they were reading the little cartoon books with the great cartoon characters and the bits added to the cartoon characters as soon as they were reading books. Because we wanted to normalize it, we wanted to get them to understand it, and most of all, we wanted them not to be ashamed of it, so that when they got to the playground and their friends went Willie or whatever it is, they'd go, "You're an idiot. I already know all about this," and get it in a sensible way. So, but I think to answer Damian's early question, we've messed it up royally at times. I think it's through embarrassment. It's often through genuine care. We just don't want people to make mistakes, and so we say, "Don't do that," without grappling with the complexities of it. And I'm just guessing, if we Protestants haven't been perfect, I'm probably guessing on this matter, the Roman Catholics probably aren't competing with us either.
Yeah, I go with you.
I'm right with you, Dave, and that's definitely the way I've done. I've not taught my kids it's a thou shalt not, and that's the end of the conversation. We're not going to talk about it ever again. Like you, my wife and I have determined, in an appropriate, ethical, pure way, that's not going to totally doom my children to counselling sessions, therapy for the rest of their lives. We've determined to model a healthy marriage. We've had lots of really open, detailed conversations about sex, and very little of it has to do with scripture, and so much of it has to do with clinical psychology, about the brain chemistry, about the super glue effect, the bonding effect between a man and a woman who have sex repeatedly, and how destructive that is to break, especially if you're forming multiple attachments with different people through the biological reality of sexual attachment.
That's right.
Again, we're not being prudish about it, but we are being Christian values about it. And this is not a Christian show. I can't stop being who I am.
You're doing it a lot, aren't you?
But what I do think is good policy for Australia is Christian values. And so without the because Leviticus argument, it is a good idea to not sleep around for really. And if you want to use the Greens argument, science says.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
That's what we did. I mean, I'm in my 50s, so I grew up in the 80s. No. So yes. So it's like you just know, right? You know that promiscuity is not going to bring you happiness, and I think even men know that.
Try as you may.
And I've never known any happy playboys in my life. I can tell you now. Yeah. Most guys I speak to would say by the time they got to sort of 30, it was like, I just want to be with someone that I can sit at home on a Saturday and watch cartoons with and just be myself, or watch movies with. Not have to perform. Hey,
Dave, while we're talking about what we teach our kids, can we just briefly combat that ridiculous notion that's been going around on a side conversation about this whole topic, that somehow I am victim blaming if I talk to my daughter about wisdom on behavior and perhaps even clothing, and other stuff, as though pointing out to her that she ought to be looking after herself and not taking unnecessary risks is somehow blaming her for something that happens. So all I want to say on that one, Dave, is that I will believe the people that say that they actually genuinely believe it when they leave their homes unlocked, when they leave for work, when they leave their cars unlocked, when they leave their computers and phones and wallets just lying around on the street, and particularly if they don't get their own kids to be careful when it comes just to cyber safety as well. In all these different things, dealing with these things, looking after minimizing risk, because there are bad people out there, is never blaming the victim. It's just saying we've just got to be sensible. There are people out there who will do horrendous things. It's not your fault if they do them to you, but we can all minimize risks. It's irresponsible, surely, to think otherwise.
Yeah, I wrote an article this afternoon, which is on The Good Source, just dealing with Daisy Turnbull's article and the lack of wisdom in there, and also drawing into the fact that it's in the week where people, leftists, progressives, were outraged because the Chief of Defence dared to tell his young cadets that there was a degree of responsibility on themselves to behave in a way and avoid situations where they became easy targets and prey.
And dress appropriately.
Of predators, attractive, alcohol, alone. I think there was another fourth risk factor that started with A. My point was that, I want to teach my daughter to have enough respect for herself to understand that not everybody else does have the same level of respect for her. And so given that everybody else doesn't have the same level of respect for her, she needs to make sure that she's avoiding those situations where she can be taken advantage of. For example, leaving her car unlocked, or playing on the road at a younger age. And now it's, don't be drunk, don't be alone with a strange guy who may take advantage of you, and don't choose friends who would let you. Don't go to those events where it's possible. Protect yourself, and you have enough respect for yourself. And it's just a level of basic parental care and duty of care from anybody in authority, such as the Chief of Defence, to say, you know what, I can't control other people, but you can control yourself, and you can avoid those situations which are recklessly risky.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's nothing I detest more than that whole victim shaming, blaming argument, because I think it is. I would refer to the man who wrote the book, one of my favorite authors, and his name has just slipped my mind at the moment, but it'll come back to me.
Not Dr. Seuss.
No, not Dr. Seuss, unfortunately. Poor old Dr. Seuss, a whole other story. No, but I think the idea that, we have to have the other side of this conversation.
Yes.
And the other side of this conversation, our society is ignoring, because it doesn't want to go there. And they don't want to go there because it does lend itself to this question of victim shaming and victim blaming. But we have a society that uses media and advertising, persuasion, uses sex as to sell things. Yeah. It's always been the case, but never so much probably as now do we see sexual advertising directed at men in all sorts of ways. And I know that there was probably, that we've restricted now some of the explicit use of bikini models and things like that. But you've only got to look at some of the incredibly seductive imagery. It might be more covered up, or it might be a little less, cheesy, but it's nonetheless, this is an extremely strong sexual culture where we are constantly putting before boys and young men images that are, highly sexualized, and in the extent of to the extent of the semi-pornographic music industry and the music videos, to the full pornography that's available to them far too readily and accessibly online. Now, given all of that, we can't sit back then as a culture and say there's no responsibility whatsoever, or there's no power in the hands of women. Yeah. There is power in the hands of women. Young women know how to use their sexual power, and they know some of them do abuse their sexual power, just as young men abuse their physical strength and their physical power. And we have to be able to have that conversation. And so I think, the time has come where we have to say, look, some of the clothing and some of the way that things are, some of the stuff that you're wearing is not appropriate. And there has to be, some degree of, modesty, in the way, brought back into the way that we dress and the way that we flaunt and use sexuality to attract the opposite sex. And I'm not a prude either. I don't see any reason why a woman can't use her sexual power in the appropriate way, in the appropriate place, which is to attract a partner. But I don't think that women have to hide their beauty, or not decorate, not be decorative. And design is a wonderful thing, and seeing a beautiful woman dressed beautifully is a wonderful thing. But again, it comes back to the context of that, right? Is it done with respect, or is it done with sort of a brash, horrible kind of sense of, just flaunting power and there's a lot on our culture,
And dare I say, sometimes, especially our young women aren't really aware of what's going on. They're actually not aware of what they're doing, but they are being fed again the same images about what beauty is, and it's a lot more sexualized than it needs to be. So as you can imagine, in a church environment, we occasionally sit down and have the chat, and we think very, very carefully about it as we're talking to, especially our young guys in their 20s, because they really want to think hard about romantic relationships and sexuality and all that kind of thing. They want to take it seriously. They want to do what they think is the right way, the best way, as David has been saying it before. But one of the things that we have to find just a gentle but important way of saying to young ladies is basically, we reckon you all want a man who looks in your eyes first and foremost, and not somewhere else slightly lower, and then saying, well, give him a chance. Give him a chance to, understand what they're like, understand what men are like, understand the power that you have, which, as you said, Damian, can be used very, very powerfully and often in good ways, right? But understand that and be wise about what you're doing, and also recognize why you've chosen to dress in certain ways in the first place. That you're swimming in this culture that says that can't discern between beauty and sexualization. It no longer sees the distinction. We now live in a culture. I credit this term to Steve McAlpine, who's a church pastor in Perth. He calls it not the secular but the sexular culture that we now live in. That's the predominant prevailing influence upon our culture. And the irony is, we as conservative religious types, we get said, "Why are you banging on about sex all the time?" And you just want to go, we're the ones. Really, we're the ones. The reason we talk about it is because you guys are obsessed, and somebody somewhere needs to talk some sense to you.
And we have to start having that conversation about female sexual power and the abuse of it. We also have to have the conversation about the abuse of female sexual power in the workplace, because we've had the conversation about men being inappropriate in the workplace, and I think that's hopefully the early Me Too movement, which I supported for the first few months before it got witch hunty. I think that we needed to have that shift. I've worked in environments where there was some pretty revolting stuff going on with men acting inappropriately towards women in the workplace, and just about every other woman you talk to has got one or two stories about that. So there definitely was a cultural problem there, and I'm glad that we've moved forward and fixed that. But I think that now we have to have the flip side conversation, which is that sometimes you will find women using and abusing their sexual power, particularly quite attractive women, and that's where it gets really, upsets the people who want life to be fair, right? Because the reality is that that's another dirty taboo subject that we never talk about, the question of beauty and aesthetics, and the power that beauty brings. So I think, it's just such murky territory, which is why I tend to be a bit of a libertarian and not want government to go into these areas, because I think it's just too dangerous and too muddy. But I think as a culture, we have to maybe look at some of this stuff and talk about it a little bit more. What I want to do now is head to a video that we have, just trying to flicker around here while Matt's multitasking on a million different things. So we'll get ready for this video, but the person we're about to have a brief conversation with is Darren Brady Nelson. He's an American-Australian think tanker, media commentator, and political advisor. He's currently based in Wisconsin,
but he calls Queensland home. And I had a chat with him earlier today about his attendance and observations at the CPAC conference. Darren Nelson, thank you so much for your time with us today. You spent the weekend at CPAC. Tell me exactly what is CPAC and why would the average Australian right of Stalin voter be interested in what goes on at CPAC?
CPAC stands for Conservative Political Action Conference, and it's been going, I believe, since the Reagan era, as I understand it. And it is the #1 right-wing conference, not only in the U.S. but in the planet. Now it's entitled conservative, but in the U.S. I usually play kind of a bit loose with the term conservative. So they include libertarians, they include sort of Trumpians, all that sort of thing. So it's a great sort of mix of center right and maybe a bit further right, but nothing too crazy.
Now you mentioned the word Trumpian. That's a new word. What does that mean? Is it got a broader meaning than a blind follower, devotee of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I would think so. I think it could include someone who literally just loves Donald Trump and doesn't think too much about principles, maybe just loves his style, his fighting ability, all that sort of stuff. But yeah, look, Trumpian's not well defined. I've written a couple articles on the related concept of Trumponomics. I've written twice for one of the outfits that I write for, which is Town Hall in the US. And it's really an eclectic mix of conservative, libertarian, and populist ideas.
Right.
But it is surprisingly fairly conservative. It's not like light years different from the sort of things that Ronald Reagan stood for. Not in terms of style, but certainly substance.
I think to me it probably means those people who've come to identify people like Donald Trump as what they're looking for in an elected politician, people who are wanting to drain the swamp or burst the Canberra bubble, people who are not interested in career politicians who promote the needs of big business, big media, the academy, and the entrenched political and media elite, but people who are looking for, actual conviction leadership and not just following from the front. So there's certainly an aspect of cheekiness in it as well. If somebody didn't mind being called a Trumpian because they just, it's like the basket of deplorables. It's meant as an insult when said on the lips of a leftist, but it's an insult to the left when somebody right of Stalin says it. Tell me.
Look, it's also used as a someone who would be a more mainstream person on the right might also use that term in this disparaging sense. But to bring it back to sort of Australian listeners, it's not far different than Howard's battlers. It's that sort of thing. And I think the Conservative parties, particularly under Trump recently, just taken that, it's on steroids. They've brought in working class, middle class people to the right side of politics, and a lot of black and brown people too. Not that we're into identity politics, but still, that's been important.
The segment's not actually about the word Trumpian, but I think it's a fascinating. You threw it in there, and later on in the show we're going to be talking about Malcolm Turnbull, who we've got Republicans in name only, rhinos in America. Here in Australia we've got linos, liberals in name only, where you've got people like Malcolm Turnbull who are absolutely authoritarian progressives. And the believers in big government and the far green left. So again, a Trumpian might be the opposite of a lino, just like, hey, we really are interested in Howard's battlers, a return to common sense and bursting the Canberra bubble. But back to CPAC, what did the conference overall say about where the Republican Party is at in the wake of a disastrous first month of Biden's administration for America?
Look, there were a number of themes, and definitely the sort of discussing the future of the Republican Party vis-a-vis Trump was, certainly in the top three. And we talked about Trump to start out with, but he was the last speaker on the last day, so the conference was always kind of leading up to him. So all topics in many ways centered around him. So I think the upshot, being there for the conference and being there for President Trump's speech was the Republican Party is very much the party of not only Donald Trump, but Trumpianism or Trumpism or Trumpers, whatever you sort of like label you want to use. He's fundamentally transformed the party. Sorry to use that sort of Obama terminology of fundamental transformation. This one's a good one because the Republicans, like the Liberals and the Nationals in Australia, have just kind of lingered, trying to be kind of like light versions of the opposition. The Republicans trying to be kind of Democrat light, the Liberals trying to be Labor light. It's not only unprincipled, it not only turns people off from the parties, but you lose elections. Like Turnbull, who you mentioned, yeah, he won, but he won by 1 seat, and he had a massive majority, that he inherited from Tony Abbott. Not saying Tony Abbott was brilliant, but obviously it was far better than Turnbull. And so all the conservative parties including the UK and Canada, they've all faced this sort of problem of, they've been infiltrated by leftists of various shades, be it the Turnbull types or whatever, or even like just weak-kneed conservatives, and they don't help either.
To what extent would the rhinos, the anti-Trumpers, have stayed away from CPAC and thereby, I guess, tinted the perception of where the Republican Party is at now if CPAC was the finger on the pulse?
Look, they did stay away. I mean, I can't say for whether there were some supporters of Mitch McConnell there or something like that, but I can certainly tell you all the people in the House and the Senate who voted to impeach Trump stayed away. And to tell you the truth, even if they didn't vote, I mean, those same people like Mitch McConnell, Romney, I'm not sure the last time they've ever shown up to a CPAC. This is really not the speakers, but the people there are very grassroots. The real heart and soul of not just the Republican Party, but the broader kind of conservative and liberty movement. These people really believe in what they're there for, and they want to get something done. And what they loved, I suppose, about Trump in particular was, he said, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then he did X, Y, and Z. Not even Ronald Reagan can claim that. Now, there's reasons for why Ronald Reagan couldn't. He faced, a Democrat Congress the entire time, whereas, at least Trump got 2 years. Unfortunately, 2 years of a rhino-dominated House and Senate, so they didn't get as much done. All they got was the tax cuts, really.
Tell me, finally, what has CPAC revealed, if anything, about this? Is certainly one of his first major appearances after Biden's inauguration. What's the future for Trump? What kind of role has he staked out for himself, if any, in the fight against the evil regime of the Democrats, Biden, and the potential resurgence of Republicans in 2 or 4 years' time?
Well, he has definitely staked himself out as the leader of the party. Mitch McConnell, isn't even really the leader of the Senate. He is in name, officially, but he really doesn't even control most of the senators on the Republican side in the Senate. So he's definitely the leader of the Republican Party. He's unequivocally going to help in the 2022 elections. He's going to unequivocally help with trying to get election reform, because obviously if we don't get that, Republicans aren't going to be winning a whole lot anyway. And he strongly hinted, although he didn't come out and say explicitly, that he would be the candidate in 2024. So I think it's basically his candidacy to be had. So if he changes his mind, where he was leaning towards running in 2024. But if he reserves the right, obviously, to decide whether he does or doesn't. Fortunately, we saw some great potential people who can step in, not as, obviously not the same sort of gravitas or movement as Trump, but, the 2 governors in particular, Florida, DeSantis, and South Dakota, Noem. Those two as a ticket would be a great ticket if Trump doesn't run. I should mention, Trump's speech largely echoed also kind of the whole conference. By far the biggest topic that was discussed over the 3 days was election integrity. And, and not only just what happened, but what are we going to do about it, and what can we change? There was also some other great topics. God and religion was probably the second biggest topic.
Wow.
So, Christians, and to a much lesser extent, Jews are there in quite big force. And Christians, we're talking, I didn't come across any Orthodox, but there were plenty of Protestants and Catholics. In fact, on Sunday, they had multiple services, and I ducked my head into both the Protestant and the Catholic, and they were just both full. Every hour on the hour, both were just chock full of worshipers. So I think that's a great sign as well, that it's not, kind of the atheist side of the conservative and libertarian movement that's dominating. It's actually the Christian side. And again, to a lesser extent, the Jewish side as well.
That's brilliant. I can't think of anything better for the foundation of a party platform, let alone a nation, than Christian values. So well done to CPAC for that. Darren Brady Nelson in the United States, thank you so much for your update and report on CPAC this year.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Well, we're grateful for Darren for his report about CPAC. Grateful that he got given press credentials to be able to pop along and not have to pay for the tickets. They're really expensive. Actually, have a look at the CPAC cost of tickets and then just thank God for the cost of church and state tickets. So much cheaper.
But what's the green room as good? Dave, was the green room as good? I got to experience your green room, and you looked after us very well. Thank you.
My pleasure. One of the things I try and achieve with the summit is a time of refreshing for the speakers. So it doesn't feel like they're coming to work, but it feels like they're coming to a meeting of co-belligerents where we're just relaxing and talking with people who are in the trenches and fighting and sticking our head above the parapets to see what the Satanists have to say about us, which is thoroughly amusing. Now, your show tomorrow, Damian, has a whole lot of information about CPAC. What can we look forward to?
Well, what it's got is it features what I think was the best speech out of CPAC, which is the governor of a very small state of South Dakota, Kristi Noem. It does feature Trump. Yes, we do have some.
His wasn't the best speech, though.
No, well, I just think Kristi Noem. It was the best articulation of conservative and classical liberal values and thinking that I've heard since this whole COVID nightmare started.
Wow.
She talks about how she treated her people like adults, how she didn't lock the state down, how she asked people to do the right thing, how she didn't feel it was appropriate to be going and fining people and treating them like children and infantilizing them in the middle of a crisis.
Yep.
But she took very much to heart the principles of liberty and fundamental freedoms and civil liberties and human rights, and asked people to do the right thing and got fantastic compliance as a result of that without having to go out with a big stick and be all police statey about it.
Genius.
Incredible, isn't it? Amazing.
How very refreshing.
Yeah, all you have to do is pick up a basic crisis management textbook and it'll be on chapter 1. But anyway,
that's all I ever wanted.
Anybody's ever done it.
That's all I ever wanted from our government was trust us. Treat us like adults. You say science says, show us the science. Show us the models. Let us criticize them, let us have a debate, and let us reach our own conclusions independently. If science truly says, and it's not a political bureaucratic policy call, then what have you got to be afraid of by showing us the data that has helped you reach this conclusion? If it's so irrefutable, what are we, idiots that we want to kill ourselves? Well,
or are we so negligent of other people's rights and our sense of duty and care to others that we would put others in serious danger? I think most people, and you only need about 90% compliance anyway.
Yeah.
Most people would do the right thing.
Yeah.
So I think all of that, and I've been saying this right since the beginning, right since March last year, that it's been real overkill on the part of governments and very infantile and very consistent with what I saw as somebody who left Australia 20 years ago and then came back, was the nanny state, the evolution of the nanny state in Australia, and this desire to be told what to do, this desire to have the burden of responsibility and adult responsibility taken off our shoulders, so that we can just sit at home and watch Netflix and not have to be grown-ups. And we want to be infantilized, and we want Daddy Dan to tell us, and Daddy Anastasia and, Mummy Gladys to tell us when we can and when we can't do things. To be fair to Gladys, of course, she's done the best of all in terms of managing this. And she actually came out, front page of the Australian today, don't know if you saw it, but basically Gladys Berejiklian saying that we now need to really sit back and reflect on the way we're going to manage this thing going forward and move to a more of a flu-type treatment of it.
I did see you send me that.
Yeah, and she's absolutely right. We can't continue with this.
That was always the case.
Stop counting case numbers by day.
This is the nonsense of emergency powers. It's an emergency until you have time to put in place your contingency. Then it's no longer an emergency. Now it's, well, we planned for this because we've been planning for it because it's a year old. There's no emergency. This is the situation we're dealing with. Another
thing that we do on the show this week is exactly that. We take Dan Andrews' last shutdown press conference on the 12th of February, and I do a little bit of a PR guide back analysis of it for you. So we look at how he framed it.
Because you're a professional PR consultant, so you're seeing his levers and
so this is how the messaging is how it's all structured. So he started by framing everything, first of all, in terms of this being a massive new threat of a high velocity, hyper intensive UK strain, which of course it wasn't in the end. But if you listen to his speech, everything sounds incredibly reasonable and fair and reasonable and sensible. And that's Dan Andrews' performance strength. He's able to make anything sound reasonable. He's the reasonable man.
Like Obama.
And that's his style, yes.
An extremist who sounds reasonable.
Right, yeah. And I think that, I don't know about Obama being an extremist, but I certainly disagree with a lot of Obama's stuff.
There was nobody more partisan in the Senate. Obama sounded like the great uniter, the great hope. He had the highest record of partisanship. There was no more partisan senator before he became president. And there's so many other things that just, but he's just such a great orator and such great charisma and presence on the stage.
Yeah.
It was beguiling.
And Dan does the whole, that sort of, I'm just an ordinary bloke, I'm just an ordinary Aussie bloke thing. And so it builds rapport very nicely with the audience. Then he sets up the thing, and I take you through the stages of it in the thing, and then the punch comes, right? So he's ready to now say, Melbourne, we're locking you down for 5 days. We're locking the entire state for 5 days down. Yep. There's no science, no justification for it. Definitely no science for locking down anything outside of Melbourne. You lock down the whole state. So we have a good deep look at that, and we just asked the question, and hi to all of our Victorian viewers tonight, but it's time to start thinking, if you're a Victorian, a little bit differently, I think. Why have we sort of accepted this? And what happened now is we're in a situation where we've normalized it, so that when the politicians come out and say, oh, we're taking away all your liberties for 5 days, it's like, okay.
Or 12 months.
Yeah. So it's really quite a dangerous situation. We've moved and permitted this to happen. And to be fair, to be politically balanced about it, I don't think that we can let our Prime Minister off the hook in terms of his responsibility to bring some adulthood into the room and some adult thinking into the room.
Well,
because we need to...
If the people want to be infantilized, the Prime Minister has given them what they want. What we have with democracy is the rule of people, whether they be virtuous and intelligent or unvirtuous and gullible. And if they want to be treated like babies in a nanny state, then that is what democracy voted for. And it's up to us to make the case to change the intelligence and education and desires of the average voter. And we either prevail or we don't. And that's why...
And I've never heard a better articulation of that from a leader than Kristi Noem and her speech at CPAC. So
I'm looking forward to your show, Damian.
Do have a listen to it. Yep.
David, do you want to weigh in on this topic at all, or just wait till you've heard Damian's podcast tomorrow on the good source?
Well, I'm really looking forward to the podcast. That kind of thing fascinates me. As a preacher myself, I'm fascinated by rhetoric and presentation, and I'm well aware that in terms of what we communicate, only about 10% of what we communicate is the raw content of the words. There's loads of other stuff that's going on. That means that communication is an incredibly powerful thing. It can be used for great good or for great evil. Just on Dan Andrews and what he's like and his approach to freedom, I think if any of us who are Christians were under any illusions about what his view on freedom is, and the recent bill that's passed through the Victorian government, championed by him, restricting freedom for people who want to explore transitioning themselves, either whether it be gender issues or of course, most terribly, Dan would say, people who are same-sex attracted and don't want that and want to explore what it might mean to work against that and reconcile those sorts of things to other convictions that they have. They've now criminalized that and criminalized those of us who seek to help them. So that kind of it's no surprise to me that the same guy that promotes that sort of stuff seems to be quite happy with extraordinary restrictions on freedom. And look, I'm like most guys. I think it was quite necessary, wasn't it, for us to have some restrictions put in place? I mean, like it or not, COVID clearly is very dangerous, and the record in other countries shows us that. The fiercely freedom-loving streak of America, as much as we might applaud it in some senses, has obviously also led to a pretty horrific situation in some parts of the United States. Although that's obviously not the whole thing that's going on. It's very interesting, isn't it, that in a lot of the blue states, it's far worse than the red states, despite their crackdowns. But nevertheless, some restrictions are required. But yeah, that general thing now where we're stopping and saying, hang on a minute, is this all required in this way? And should this be happening? And the way it's happening, I think, yeah, I'm totally with Damian on that. I think we need to start asking some questions, and sensible leaders will be sensitive to those issues and find that fine balance between respecting people and protecting them.
So what do you think about this question, David, from someone whose mother named him entropic dissident, which is a rather unfortunate birth certificate to have if you have to have one. Even if the COVID-19 lockdowns end soon, are we now more primed than ever to accept a loss of liberties for other reasons in the future? Sorry, Mr. Dissident.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I see it starkly, but I wouldn't be surprised if we have been slightly cooked in the pot on this one, where we get used to things. Most things move in a ratchet effect, don't they? They move up and then they sort of ratchet away, then move up again and ratchet away, and so we get progressively more used to things and the way they move. And that's a reality. We've already talked about that in terms of our own culture's view on sexualization and how we've sort of got used to more and more things that a generation ago we would have thought were outrageous. So we understand the concept. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. That's why now is the time just to be asking the right questions. I think we need to be marked by sensible questions. There's some really crazy stuff going on in some fringe areas, and I think we want to be very cautious about some of the argumentation that's been made. And yet at the same time, yeah, some proper, cautious and persistent questioning is important now.
Entropic dissident is giving us a laugh, so no offense taken. Wonderful choice. Now, David, I have been in trouble in times past. Been the subject of fierce criticism and accusation, because I've been caught in photographs with people who've had perhaps misconstruable, unfortunate symbolism and acquaintances. There are some people out there, believe it or not, who are not entirely sincere and not entirely civil, not entirely wanting to engage on the substance of topics, and rather character assassinate people that I'm seen with, and therefore me, guilt by association. And I can't help noticing you somewhat proudly displaying the white supremacist symbol of a Dr. Seuss book in your background. Tell me that's.
I thought you were going to say the British flag.
No.
I can't believe it ended up there. I thought I tidied everything away. No, actually, about 20 minutes before we came on air, I said to my kids quickly, "Oh, let's get some Dr. Seuss up there. Let's get it up." And I said, "We got any Dr. Seuss in the house?" And that was the best one. Actually, it was either that or Fox in Socks or what's this bad boy? 1, 2.
Shocking.
That's a good one. And then finally at the back, oh, the places you'll go, especially into jail if you read too much Dr. Seuss to your kids. No, got it up. The irony is we were chatting. My kids were like, "Why?" And then one of them went, "Oh yeah, because the Dr. Seuss has been banned. And what's it been banned about?" And then I'm so proud of her. My 17-year-old daughter, whose mum is Chinese, and whose dad is very pasty white, as you can see, and who embraces her inner Asian thoroughly and loves it. When, "Oh yeah, some of the characters in one of those books were too Chinese," and everyone got upset. And I think her next words were like, "What idiots." So she wasn't mortally offended, although one bit of me is disappointed because I could have found a good lawyer and probably got some damages for the unintentional harm that Dr. Seuss had caused my daughter.
Yeah, well, yeah, definitely.
And it was a self-banning.
Yes.
It was Dr. Seuss Family Publishing Company. They're just not publishing these 5 titles that have these images that David was just talking about in them. So
yeah. Now, like we laugh, don't we? But actually, the fact that they self-censored before there was any great hue and cry just shows you how powerful now the cancel culture is. That you would self-censor. That is quite terrifying, isn't it? Or alternatively, just shows you what a grip some of this nonsense has got on people.
Yeah. Well, also, you know, I mean, my kids are also half Asian, David, and they, I mean, you look at these images in the book, the Chinese caricature of the Chinese guy with the chopsticks and the bowl and the traditional Chinese outfit on. It's like, what's offensive about that? Are you insulting? It's an insult to Chinese culture to say that you can't draw a comic.
And of course, these were written in a day when the nations were different from each other, when we all hadn't become Americanized by global media and the machine of Hollywood, and the internet and travel wasn't as easy as it was. And there actually were cultural distinctives about all these people. They were accurate, not...
Well, I lived in Hong Kong for 16 years and we still use chopsticks, all right? They have chopsticks. Nobody's using knives and forks. So,
but I use chopsticks now.
It is ridiculous. We were actually watching...
Sorry.
We watched a bit of telly together as our family a while ago, and in the show, someone made a stupid joke about, "Oh, there's my friend Hoofling Poo," and the guy on the show just goes, "Oh, you don't even know him," and yeah, but it's a joke. And do you know who laughed loudest in our house? My wife.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So just, you know, let's all just grow up a little bit, shall we?
And the irony of this, of course, was that Dr. Seuss, the man, was a lefty. He was incredibly on the side of, you know, today we might be on opposite sides, except he was back in the day sensible. And for those who are not familiar with the distinctions I make, there's a big difference between a lefty and a leftist. A lefty is someone who just has a slightly different philosophical bent than me, but a leftist is dogmatic and radical about it. And, you know, I'm not trying to be conservative. I'm just trying to be right, not right wing, but as in correct. And if I'm wrong, I'm grateful for the correction. But he was very much anti-racism. He very much had a narrative that people should be accepted, appreciated, and valued for who they are, that there was an inherent dignity and equality to all of us, despite our differences, that differences are essentially surface deep. And so, yeah, it's so unfortunate that they feel that that message wasn't clear while embracing the differences that we have. What have you got there?
I'm just looking at the images that are so offensive and hurtful. And there really isn't anything in any of these images, as far as I can see, that is in any way sort of negative. They're stereotypes in some cases, but so are the images of the Englishmen in top hats. And stereotypes are...
Yes, I'm personally affronted by that.
Yeah, that top hat thing. It's because you're all bald.
Well,
yeah.
look,
I was dismayed because the top hat was with the wrong suit.
There you go.
The assumption that we British don't know how to dress was appalling. Yeah.
Hopefully we are minutes away from Robbie Katter joining us. And in fact, I've heard him just join us now. He's been at a function all night and been held up, as politicians are wont to do. Very important places to go and people to see. Robbie, we're going to throw you in the mix really, really soon. So I can see you're just not quite settled yet, so we'll give you an extra 30 seconds. But let me share what we're going to be talking about. And that is a recent post from Katter's Australian Party just a couple of days ago. And the text accompanying this picture says, KAP, which is short for Katter's Australian Party, will continue to stand up for taxi drivers. It is shocking that rideshare operators have been allowed to come in unregulated. Once upon a time, hardworking Australians saved up and invested in a taxi license to provide for their family. Many people invested their life savings. Governments allowing rideshare operators like Uber to enter the market unregulated have had a devastating impact on the taxi industry, and it's a completely uneven playing field. As well as protecting people's livelihoods, it is also about keeping people safe and protecting the industry as a profession. Taxi drivers have a history of taking pride in their work and knowing the many roads and streets of the area they service. When you invest in a license, you've got skin in the game, so it's your interest to provide a top-notch service. Meanwhile, Uber brags on its website that you can sign up now and start driving in as little as 2 days. Please think twice next time you need a ride somewhere, and a few hashtags there. So welcome, Robbie Katter. Great to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Dave. Apologies for the tardiness. Yeah, just out here in Julia Creek tonight with all the mayors and councillors, and yeah, look, that's been a very big issue for us, the taxis, and I was just talking to one of the drivers last night, all for reform and competition and breathing, healthier markets through competition. That's a reasonable virtue to have as a politician. But there's a few key points I'd like to make on the taxi industry. When Uber addressed the parliamentary committee to my bill, which was about levelling the playing field, so making them provide things like third-party insurance, mandating the security camera in the car, and having a limitation on the price surging. When they appeared before the committee, one of the questions put to them was, well, you acknowledge that you're currently breaking the law by your operations, which they acknowledged and said, we do. We are breaking the law, but you just need to catch up, because people want us. At which point I felt, well, I may as well throw my parliamentary license, my ticket to operate as a politician in the bin, because I thought we go down there to legislate and part of that's keeping regulations to keep people safe, or for whether they're good or bad, we debate them out and make laws for people to abide by. But if you're a big enough corporation that feels you've got more money, deeper pockets than the government for the courts, and you've got public opinion on your side, particularly on the young people, then you're above the law, and you can, and that's exactly what they said. I have an issue with that. And I'd also add, the first time I ever heard of Uber was at the QHA conference, and they had it in a regional area one year, and one of their agenda items, curiously, was about Uber, and I didn't even know what Uber was at the time. And to which some of the hotel operators at that said, well, why the hell are we talking about a rideshare app at a hotels, pubs association industry group? And they said, well, what's to stop them having Uber pubs selling booze in an unregulated environment? It'd be a lot cheaper out of the back of their house or from their garage, and kiss goodbye to all the equity people having pubs. And the last point I'd like to make is, as soon as Uber was legalised, there was a union put together by Uber drivers saying they're not getting paid enough. There's now complaints about surge pricing. There's been continued complaints about security. in which case the government will inevitably end up regulating Uber, in which case you'll inevitably end up with a taxi industry just 10 years down the track. But all you've done is recapitalise the industry to an overseas company that pays no tax in Australia, and it kissed goodbye about 90 million in taxes. So someone better tell me where we're going to get those extra taxes from, $90 million the government no longer receives from Australian-owned businesses, and someone's better tell me why we're going to, let someone else that's inevitably going to encounter the same regulations that they're celebrating that they bypassed in the first place.
Yeah.
So none of it to me made sense. I've got 33 licenses in my electorate. So politically, it's a dud for me to represent. Really, it doesn't win me votes. It's not politically popular, but it's a principal issue, and I think it's disgusting that the government just rolled over. They should have, at the very least, made an entry fee for Uber. If they want to participate in a market, you're welcome to come in, but you need to have some regulatory standards. And one of those is that taxis provide about 20 or 25% of their fleet for disabled. There's no such regulation. There's no regulations on Uber. So we're now trying to find alternate means of transport for a lot of our less fortunate, disabled, elderly, because a lot of those maxi taxis and disabled taxis aren't there now. So thanks very much, Uber, for that. And it's created all these issues, and it's just, to me, it's just weak government and maybe lack of intelligence in government. I don't know, but that's why I took such a strong stance against it, Dave.
Okay. I'm definitely a free market kind of person who would be naturally disposed to being anti-regulation, and I know Damian would be as well. We'll come back to those arguments, though. What I'm, I guess, wanting to get your comments on, brief comments on first, and then we might see what David Ould has to say, because I have no idea where he falls on this issue at all. I know that this is a government failure, and the first point you made was about enforcement. Now, when Uber came in, it was the Campbell-Newman government, and Scott Emerson was the Transport Minister in Queensland. He sent Uber a cease and desist letter as the Minister of Transport, which Uber promptly ignored, and that was the end of it. There was no follow-up at all. So what would you do to be tough instead of weak on non-compliance with the law as it is, if you had the opportunity to make and enforce the rules?
Oh, well, like I said, Dave, I think competition is great, and we can't just and certainly those standards had to be lifted in the taxi industry, and you need to introduce competition to do that. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater either. That doesn't mean you completely deregulate straight away or go from 0 to 100 in a matter of 12 months. And what I would have done is said, you're welcome to come to this market. We admire the technology you bring and the advantages you can bring to that market, and perhaps you can lift the standard of ride share or that the industry. But if you want to come in, there's going to have to be a service fee, because there's a cost, and anyone else entering a market anywhere else in the world has an entry cost, and you've just bypassed that entry cost by bypassing the regulations. The only reason that there's a market established around those taxi licenses is because the government said to them, we'll preserve a place for you so that you can operate under these regulations and provide a protection from surge pricing, or there's regulated pricing, and you'll be required to operate a 24-hour service no matter what as part of your license. You'll be required to have 24-hour rolling security checks on your drivers. You'll be required to have a mandated security camera in every car, those sort of things. But so if my bill that I put into Parliament, legislation, was about really just trying to level the playing field by saying, well, you're welcome to come here, Uber, but if you're going to do that, you must have guarantee people you've got third-party insurance, which they couldn't, and you must guarantee people you've got a security camera, because most people are accustomed to that, and the customers aren't making fully informed choices because they don't really know that they've been shrouded in the security of having those regulations there. They're not that well informed, which the definition of the economic definition of it is having the participants in the market having that information. So if you don't have a well-informed consumers, they're not making well-informed choices. So they're supporting this one just based purely on price, but they're not realising that security cameras were put into taxis following a big push when there was a mass murder in Perth so many years ago. So they regulated from there that they'd have cameras in taxis to protect from, and who knows how many people that saved over the years, we don't know. But I think we would appreciate the fact that that was regulated and mandated, but that's not mandated anymore. And there's still security messages in Uber that are good, but I just can't get away from those things were put there for a purpose, a very deliberate purpose. And sure, there's been inefficiencies built around that marketplace in taxis, but the solution should have been that putting an entry price on Uber to come into the market. I think they said they recapitalised some $2 billion worth of taxi licenses, so maybe 500 million of the compensation package to taxis should have been put back as a price tag to Uber, who I think they're a capitalised value of 90 billion. So, I don't think it was unfair asking them to save $500 million to give to the government, to give to taxpayers, to let them exit the industry with some dignity. And we've seen suicides from a number of taxi owners who have just put their server into it. That's a fact. So I think it's very poorly handled. It's handled from immature and perhaps a scared government that just wanted to be popular with the people.
Let's head to Sydney and ask one of our Mexicans, David Ould. What's your thought on the whole Uber versus taxis regulation?
What a fascinating conversation. I've got to say, at the start, when I first heard that we were going to be talking about this topic, I think, Dave, I was very much with you. I'm a freedom man, and so the idea of a free market very much appealed to me. There's something quite exciting about disruption into markets. I mean, what we're doing here tonight is essentially much the same thing. But listening to Robbie, I feel myself pushed back a little bit in the opposite direction. I think I'm not persuaded by everything that I hear. I'm not sure the insurance question is quite as big. Admittedly, I don't know as much about it. I do know now when I'm buying my car insurance, they're asking me whether I'm using my car in that way. In terms of the knowledge of the streets that these guys have, I worked for many years in London, where the cabbies were famous for the knowledge that they have to have, but quite frankly, now they just punch it into the GPS, right? And it takes them there. I'm not sure that that's any more a distinguishing factor. We talk about the regulations that are in place. I just wonder if they are maybe some of them outdated. I can see the need for safety, but I wonder if there's other ways to ensure that. But I think what I'm intrigued by is this idea that the customer is not well informed. One answer to that is to say they're not informed about some of the risks and then legislate about all the risks. I wonder if another answer is to make sure that the customers are better informed about what the difference is in the product that they're getting between a taxi driver and a rideshare drive, and then still make their decision based on that. Puts me back in the free market situation again. I just fear. I get the sense there's some truth to what Robbie's saying. There's something there that really needs to be grasped hold of. But I wonder if it's just we're at that point in history where time has come for the taxi industry, and the rideshare guys have really just disrupted this in an incredible way. And actually, ultimately, 10, 15 years down the track, we'll look back at this turbulent period and say the consumer won ultimately because of it. Now, I know that means that some people are going to be out of a job, and I appreciate all that. And I think, there are moments where the government sometimes steps in and looks after people as an industry collapses. Maybe there's a place for that. I don't know, but I just wonder if part of it is we just got to go. Maybe the time has come. I've got to say, I haven't taken a cab in years. I've taken plenty of Ubers in the last couple of years, and I don't think I'm dumb. I don't think I'm uninformed. I know you're not saying that I am, but maybe we're just there, and it's sad, but it's just the reality of the market that we're in.
Yeah, I think Uber had a lot of trouble in a lot of markets worldwide when it introduced, and they had massive protests in Paris from taxi drivers, in the UK from taxi drivers. I was living in Hong Kong at the time. They couldn't get a grip in the Hong Kong market because taxis are cheap in Hong Kong. It's a small city with very dense population, so it's very easy to get a taxi and get around very quickly. But most importantly, and this is where I disagree with Robbie, the government of Hong Kong wasn't rent-seeking. We have had a hideous situation in Australia for decades, where the taxi industry has been one of the worst examples of economic rent-seeking. Economic rent-seeking is when you set up a barrier, you create an economic barrier of entry that's false, that's not actually in the market for a reason. So it's different to things like having requiring certain safety things, or requiring security, or requiring insurance and all of that sort of thing, which I fully, it is the role of government to develop the playing field and keep the playing field fair for all players, and all players should have to play on a level playing field. What needs to happen here is not for us to punish Uber or charge Uber for coming into the Australian market. What needs to happen here is we need to regulate Uber to the same way that we regulate the taxi companies, and we need to give back the money that the government stole from those individual small businesses that set up taxis, because it is, rent-seeking is a form of theft. I'm a classical libertarian. Government has no right to take that money or to put up a wall or a barrier around this industry. They've used it for decades. And I used to come home to Australia, go out for a night, have a couple of drinks, want to get home safely, get into a taxi, and to go from the centre of Brisbane to Holland Park, which is like going to Ivanhoe in Melbourne or going to Neutral Bay in Sydney, and having to pay $45 to get home. Well, you know you've got a problem. And the taxi drivers would say, it's not us, it's the bloody government and the licensing and all this equipment we're required to have. We need as minimal regulation as possible. We need no government license fees, and we need to give back to every existing taxi license holder today. Give them back their $500,000, or at least some portion of it, based on how many years they've had to compete with Uber. That's the step in the right direction. It's not to punish Uber, because then you're punishing the client and you're running an industry for the industry instead of for the client. And
so as free marketeers, perhaps we're complaining about not just restrictions on the free market in the future, but actually looking back and going, that's been the problem in the first place. Hey, Robbie, can I just say, mate, as the panel moves against you on this, and we all seem to be disagreeing with you, one of the original questions that I had in my head was, how many guys are there actually with licenses? How many will this affect? Because I want to get a sense of just how big the issue is. But can I just say, you answered that from the side, which was to say there's a limited number of guys in your constituency, so it's not a political vote winner. Can I just say, as I heard that, I just went, oh, gee, how good is it to have a conviction politician who is convinced on a principle of a matter, and you're doing it not because there's votes in it, because you're genuinely convinced some people are going to really hurt from this and you want to look after them. Can I just say, even as on the principles of the thing, I'm kind of just going, I don't think I'm with you on the argument. Can I just say, that is just refreshing. I want to encourage you in that. Keep looking after your constituents. If we had more MPs like that, we'd be a much happier place.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, at least it gives a bit of contrast in the debate, I guess. In fact, I'm not so sure. Those last comments, I'd probably agree with just about all of them. That was my position precisely, was that I'm not against competition or disruptive technology. I'm not a Luddite, but I felt, and I'm not familiar with that term, that rent-seeking, but that is exactly the basis of the class action that my father put on behalf of the taxi industry, is that you can't create this industry artificially and then rip it away from them at the same time without compensating them. And that was the exact basis of my legislation, was saying, happy to have you here, guys, but you've got to pay your way, and there needs to be at least a set of standards, because I don't think the public are fully informed on the safety and security that's shrouded around some of those things. And that's not to disrespect some of the, there's some embedded security, I guess, with driver identification and map tracing and that sort of thing that on the Uber. I respect that, but there is definitely a deficit of safety standards that you would have to, a mandatory camera in the front. That's a pretty is a well-definable safety standard. And in fact, if you revisit the debates with Scott Emerson, they agreed with this in the debates. In fact, it's a pretty peculiar thing in Queensland Parliament history, but there was a lot of disruption that night, and there was confusion. It was a hung Parliament, and my bill most clauses got voted for. Then they brought it back under a ruse the next day and colluded together two major parties as they realised they'd been not really hoodwinked, but they'd made a mistake, and they were still debating the next day in favour of clauses that they voted against, which was just still, I can't get my head around that you can speak for a clause and vote against it in Queensland Parliament. No, it makes a big deal out of it, but because they agreed, they said, look, yeah, we should have third-party insurance in a taxi. Of course you should. People should be able to hop in the car and know that they're insured. But a lot of people don't realise that they weren't, and it was not proven that they definitely weren't, but they couldn't guarantee it. So you should just have that security. They're pretty sort of, I thought, pretty uninterventionist sort of clauses I put in there in my legislation, but it still didn't get up. And look, I'm probably a lot more tuned into these principal issues because I live in a regional area, and where you have market capacity, free markets work a lot better. But often we're the losers in those policies, and I often say Australia or Queensland's way too big for one set of laws or policies, and all too often we're seen as we become an inadvertently negatively impacted by a lot of these policies. So I've always I'm always on the front foot with those sort of things, I guess, because look at every town, and it's quick to explain, every town and city in my electorate is projected to decline over the next 10 years. So I'm sort of fighting for survival out here. That's why I guess I'm pretty serious about all this stuff.
Yeah. Look, I think the problem I have is actually with some of the wording. I agree pretty much with what you've said. So everything you've said tonight, I agree with. I think I don't mean to be too universal, but the conclusion of there's a problem outlined in this picture here. Taxi license values have been pushed over a cliff. In 2014, on average, taxi licenses sold for $500,000, certainly the value of a home. Now, for everybody's context, so you know, I actually worked in the taxi industry as a driver. Got a great friend who owned lots of taxi licenses, and he let me drive one of his taxis on Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night in the city, just to make some extra cash flow during the early days of business many years ago. So I have some immersion and some experience in there, just for a bit of context. Now, in December 2020, after an average taxi license being roughly the same value as an average house, 3 taxi licenses sold for $3,000. That's basically $1.5 million reduced down to $3,000. It's ridiculous. Now, the conclusion of the picture says this is what happens when you allowed rideshare operators like Uber in unregulated. That's the bit where I disagree. I think this is what happens when you allow government to excessively interfere in the free market and economies, which they should be keeping their sticky noses out of. Now, taxi regulation was a good idea originally, and that was World War II. And it's been that long since it was a good idea. The purpose of regulating the industry back then was to create jobs and employment for those diggers coming back from the war who were unemployed. And the way of the nation looking after them was giving them jobs instead of giving them handouts. But that then became a saleable, inheritable, transferable, valuable asset which appreciated in value, so on. And it stopped being about helping people to create an income for themselves. And the government artificially created scarcity, which created this value. And at the end of the day, it shouldn't even take 2 days to become a driver. You've got GPS, there's some basic laws. If you've got your license, maybe it should only take 2 hours. And so the value actually isn't in taxi driving itself, but what the government's artificially created. To my mind, it's government interference that has created this problem. It's the government, not Uber or consumers, which owe those taxi, because they allowed this mess to come on. This should be a cautionary tale for governments. Stay out of the market, stay out of the economy as much as it is within your power. How would you, I don't mean to put you on the pressure for some amazing, innovative economic policy right now, Robbie, but how would you have, I guess, avoided that, if you even agree that that was a problem that was entirely the government's making in previous decades? How would you have maybe gotten the government out of the regulation market and made it a lot more freer and liberal and let the actual market licenses instead of artificial scarcity?
Look, that's a very good question. I don't have a very good answer for that. I said to you at the start of this conversation, I'm not against, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against invasive or progressive technology disruption. That's healthy. It's healthy to improve. And what a wonderful thing. You can improve efficiencies around transport. I'm sure it's still got a long way to go. So I'm not sure how you get from A to B. I am against governments collecting revenue on those licenses, protecting that space. I would offer this in response as an analogy. It's not a perfect comparison because there's a lot more permanency about building a unit. But if someone, let's take, in Sydney, there's 2 blocks of land out of Penrith, and there's a developer there on one side of the corner that builds a 6-pack under the regulations and the council codes and uses the building materials under the building codes and the natural lighting codes, to which everyone's voted for, right or wrong, that everyone's insisted they want these building codes to get the environmental standards and whatever else. And then another builder across the road bypasses all those, doesn't get any approvals from the government. But he's a good builder and he uses adequate materials and he's got a good reputation around the place. And he's got, a follow-up app there where people can say, yeah, I bought his units before, he's terrific bloke. People would have to ask themselves the question, they're happy with that scenario, because I think that's not a bad like with like. Because that's what we're suggesting is moving away from those regulations that they have a purpose, and some are good, some are bad, and I'd be the first to say we are highly over-regulated. I mean, that's what we stand to try and, I definitely wouldn't describe us as libertarians in our political party, because I don't think that can coexist with being a champion for regional country areas. But the idea of trying to bash out regulations, I often find myself in that position. And there's so much unnecessary regulation put into so many aspects of our lives. But there must be a place where and if I could offer one last good analogy where I think it's the same principle at play, a 7-day trade in Mount Isa, where I come from. It's a remote, isolated community, heavy Indigenous population, not a lot of services there, but, the large supermarket chains keep swallowing up all the retail trade in Mount Isa, so there's less and less owner-operators in the place. It's getting harder and harder for owner-operators to find a place. It's not there's not a large critical mass out there of consumers, so there's not as much fluidity in the market. There's not sort of one shop closes down and someone else moves in. It's actually pretty fragile, and I'm often fighting, and much to my disbenefit as a politician, because all the young people say we want 7-day trade, and I think you would want 24/7 trade if you could get it. Like, there is no pleasing the consumer's appetite. You can put open Kmart, but do you like having a corner store? And the same people that complain about Coles and Woolworths not being open 24/7 will say, well, it's terrible in Mount Isa. We have no corner stores. And that's the same what I'm saying about educating the consumer and saying, all right, but understand your choices will have a long-term impact on the livability of this city, because a lot of the Aboriginal people that don't have a car will, they walk to the shop, and that they benefit from that. A lot of your grandparents, the older people in town benefit from having that. And they would be the first people to complain in 10 years' time that there's only 2 or 3 shops to visit in Mount Isa and there's no shopping experience. So that's what I'm talking about. That I don't mean to be disrespectful to consumers, but as politicians and commentators, we have a lot more time to ponder and think about the long-term consequences of these things. And that's where I think you could make the criticism sometimes government intervening, but I would certainly argue that in places, particularly in regional areas, that some of those things are just not some of those policies are not a good fit, and they have inadvertent negative consequences that a lot of people don't acknowledge.
I appreciate your perspective on that, and I want to explore that a little bit more. I'll flick to David.
Sorry, if I could add, Dave, 7-day trade's a great idea in Brisbane or a tourism centre. I'm not altogether against it. It doesn't. You've got to think about horses for courses. So.
Yep. We'll finish with you, Damian, because I think you might be best to talk about that, but I'm interested in what David says as well. Robbie, let me just say, I think you hit the nail on the head, and we'll have furious agreement between us all that the thing that has to be achieved, I hesitate to use the words at any cost, but it's very precious and something that must be achieved in this debate, whether we increase regulation or decrease regulation. I think the outcome that we should have is a level playing field and even opportunity for taxi drivers and Uber drivers to have the same costs, the same burdens, or the same freedom and the same opportunity. And that has been a failure of government to not make it a level playing field. So 100% agree with you there. And I really appreciate your perspective on it's not exactly the same in some of these regional remote areas as it is in a big market. David, what are your thoughts on Robbie's arguments there?
Oh, look, I'm just struck by how what I thought was a simple issue actually has complexities to it that I hadn't realised. It's easy in a big metropolis like Sydney to go, what's the problem here? And yet actually, again, just being reminded there are areas which don't have the advantages that we have here, don't have the full competition that actually is so good for consumers when it drives the price down. But I'm stuck back at the point we were before, where the issue we've got is just a disparity, isn't it, between what's being asked of different segments of the industry. The taxi drivers, the burden on them in regulation is really high, and the Uber drivers is very, very low. I think a lot of what we're hearing is, increase the regulation, sort this out. But actually, we're actually talking about doing that. The problem in the first place was that the regulation was so extensive, the costs were so extensive, and there's no simple unwinding of that now. It's not easy, which again I think was the point that you were making, Dave, is don't get so stuck in it in the first place. There are no easy answers to this, but I just want to say good on Robbie for at least trying to find some.
Yeah. Mark Bishop says we need a lot more Robbies in politics, and I think a lot of people can see what he's saying there. It's the hat, Robbie. Oh, sorry, we muted
it's
you.
It's not a happy place.
Damian, your thoughts on? Well, I think Robbie's right. I mean, he's identified the local problems that you get, social problems that you get from these sorts of blanket policies. I know a little bit about the Uber history, the fact that they went in with a deliberate disruptive policy. They knew that they were going to blow up the taxi industry in different cities around the world. They knew that they were breaking all sorts of regulations and laws, and their strategy was a deliberate disruption strategy where they went in early, got entrenched, got everybody using Uber as a ride-sharing app, and then once they got their bait, they knew government would be too slow to respond, as government typically is. And then government comes in and tries to regulate, and they already had a massive campaign. I don't know if you remember, Robbie, at that time, I think it was that the Uber guys sent out every single person who got Uber got an email sent to them that they could just press with one button, send it to the transport minister.
Wow.
To complain. And they did this in so many markets, different markets around the world. It was unbelievable. Yeah, so they knew what they were doing everywhere, and they've been regulated to different levels and banned in some places. I think Germany's banned them. I'm not sure about Paris, but San Francisco's got high regulation on them now. So I think it is a question of simply. I mean, my view as a classical liberal is just the solution to the problem is not to charge Uber $500,000. It's to give the $500,000 back to the taxi guys, get everybody on that level playing field, and regulate around the things that you've got to regulate on. Yeah, you've got to have a certain number of the fleet that are ready to look after disabled people. at any time. And if Uber has to put those on themselves and pay for it themselves because they can't get drivers to do that, then that's something they should probably do.
But it was always the government that subsidised taxi drivers. Taxi drivers never did that out of the goodness of their heart. They were paid for it by the government.
Oh, were they? Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it wasn't a donation.
Well, in any case, if you want to have that, then that's got to be, again, you've got to have these. And this is the role of government, in my opinion, to create that level playing field, to play a good balancing effect, but to do it with as minimal touch regulation as you possibly can, not the lazy blanket regulation that we tend to see too much of in Australia. And we need more, we need more smart conservative politicians. I knew your dad, Robbie, when I was a young reporter. And I was very fond of him, and I think it's necessary. I'd love to get. I don't know if we allowed to tread into different areas.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're getting close to the point where we need.
Yeah,
to
I suppose we've been
up.
a little bit long, but I just wanted to ask Robbie. Look, for some of us, we're particularly on the conservative side of politics. We're very concerned about the state of the Liberal National Party, given Peter Gleeson's expose, which I read from cover to cover and was mortified by. I've just come back from 20 years living abroad, horrified by what I'm seeing in terms of the political landscape in Australia. Just as a conservative politician with an independent party, Robbie, how do you feel about how conservative politics is heading in Australia in general?
It's certainly dysfunctional in Queensland, and it's very clear to me what the problem is with the LNP, and it's that for whatever reason the National Party emasculated themselves. They don't take the stands they have, and they've lost that mandate or that right to be the default country vote in Queensland. And the N in the LNP used to be able to win regional seats back off Labor, but the L can't.
No.
And the merger has seen the L swallow the N. Therefore, they're not winning regional seats like they used to. And quite frankly, we're trying to take a lot of that vacuum up, and we see a lot of our values as very true conservative, and we feel we can win back a lot of that ground that they've lost. So either they need to split back up into separate parties, which I can't see how they can practically ever do, or just focus on those southeast city values, protect the reef and whatever else people seem to go for in southeast corner that I don't. And, they'll push for the Sydney Olympics. I won't. I'll fight against it. And people will rally behind me in the regions, and they'll probably, LNP will feel like they'll have to back it because they'll win them votes in Brisbane. But it'll mean they won't win those desperate seats they desperately need to outside of Brisbane to take government. So they've got a personality disorder where they're trying to be two things at once. Labor can handle that because they still get that default old Labor union vote in the regions, and they can't outcompete that. And that's why in 30 years they've won government twice under that brain. So it's not a thing in the organisation, it's a cultural problem they have, and they have to decide to either split or we intend on taking up that vacuum that's there in regional Queensland, which is a hard thing to do because Labor's they're pretty savvy. They've been operating pretty well, so they need to be a lot smarter, the LNP in Queensland. And to me, there may be some signs of being a bit more savvy and acknowledge. Once they acknowledge that, they can move forward, and I think they can start regaining ground. But they either need to be a Liberal Party based on winning votes in South East Queensland, pretty much like Labor are now, or they need to split up. And I don't see it practically they can split back up effectively.
Yeah, it wasn't a practical marriage right from the start, perhaps.
No, I think it's just a big mistake.
Yeah. Well, I want to switch to another topic to wrap up the night, and that is the Human Rights Children Born Alive Protection Bill 2021, which our fellow Good Source commentator and contributor George Christensen is putting to the federal parliament. And I will give the gentleman a chance to say something about this, but really this is just for the benefit of you, the viewers at home, to be involved. You're sick of seeing society go down the drain, and the Marxists make us ever more like, a horror show, a dystopian nightmare of society. Well, this is one of those things where it's such common sense. It beggars belief that it's not already the law, not already the case, or that you even need to make a law to tell people to save the lives of babies born alive. And about every 2 weeks in Queensland, and certainly many other states as well with a similar or greater population, there's a baby born alive in a late-term abortion, which is subsequently left to die, just abandoned, suffering. It's hideous and it's barbaric, and there is no law to protect these babies in most Australian states. It's the same in many, many states. But the good news is that we can stop this. Now, George Christensen has done his research and realised that the federal government has power in this area because of the External Powers Act, which means because Australia is signatory to human rights conventions, international conventions that we've signed up on, they can actually impose laws on the state to force us all to come into compliance with that. The conventions themselves don't enforce us, but it certainly is giving the government the power to do that. So there is a website where you can get more information on that, and that is georgechristensen.com.au/bornalive. Now, it's going to need us to have a vote on it in federal parliament. So the action that you need to do to put this is pressure on your local politicians. What you can do is you can write, ring, or email your federal politician. And in Queensland in particular, you can also lobby your state politician so that the party gets behind this. But ring or write to your federal politician and ask them to urge the Prime Minister to let this bill go to a vote this term of government before the next election. And if you're a member of the Liberal Party or the National Party or the LNP in Queensland, as we were just talking about, a merged entity, go to your local branch meeting, SEC, FDC meeting, and we need to get motions up across the nation stating that the Human Rights Children Born Alive Protection Act, Bill 2021, should actually be put to a vote. So in your branches, put a motion up that says, hey, we in the branch want this to go to a vote in the Australian Parliament this term. And once the motion is passed, you need to ask the chair of the meeting to send it to your party headquarters in the state and federally. Also send a note to the Prime Minister's office with a copy of that resolution. And then we need everybody watching to do this, whether you're a member of the party or not. Contact the Prime Minister's office today. Let him know you were one of the quiet Australians who voted for him. If you did, don't lie. And would like something in return now. You're speaking up and you want him personally to stand up and let this bill go to a vote. The Prime Minister's phone number for his office, you're not going to get Scott on the phone. His phone number is 02 6277 7700. That number again to ring the Prime Minister's office, 02 6277 7700. That's something that's quite important. David, have you got any thoughts on that before we say goodnight?
Well, very briefly, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? Surely, a nation, a society is marked out by how it treats its most vulnerable when they're most at need, and this seems to me just to be a common sense thing that has got to happen. However, do you know what was really interesting? We had this debate in New South Wales a couple of years ago when we effectively decriminalised abortion, and this matter was one of the many matters raised in the debate, and an amendment to the bill was moved on this matter, and the flanneling, the avoidance of this issue, by those supporting that abortion bill was spectacular to see, and I think think actually demonstrates just the paucity of the moral position that those who won't look after these children and advocate just leave them to die, the position that they're in. So you're absolutely right. This is one of those moments where I think we just need to get up and speak. I was one of the many people at the 2 rallies in Sydney against the abortion bill a couple of years ago. Huge numbers, like far greater numbers opposed to the bill than came out in support of it in the rallies. But obviously some trading was done. Let's get on this one. This is so important.
And Robbie, have you got any thoughts on this at all? For, against, tips on how to be effective from the sidelines?
I'd just add, that was very emotional. That introduction you gave, Dave. I find it difficult to debate in this space because I find it so hard to try and understand the alternate view on this. Yes. And all I'd add is that I find it really strange and such a contradiction that we spend so much time, certainly in the Queensland Parliament, about workplace health and safety laws and so much legislation. Perhaps 75% of legislation goes around. It's about keeping people safe and speed rules, so no one dies at the wheel. We can't have one person die. And as you said, just then, our most vulnerable, the babies that we're supposed to look after the most, we're leaving them die on tables. I can't get my head around it, mate. And I'm really, really grateful to be a part of this forum and some people that are willing to stand up against it, because it's an emotional topic, and I think last time we spoke, Dave, I mentioned the irrational sort of behaviour on the other side for it. The only time in Queensland Parliament, I've been there 10 years now, normally if you stand up and clap or something, you'd be thrown out of the room by the Speaker. The Speaker of the House was virtually clapping and cheering with all of the Labor government as they passed this bill and were hugging each other. No one was brought to order. And I reflected on that moment. I still reflect on that moment and think even people that maybe felt that they benefited from an abortion wouldn't be celebrating that issue. It's not an issue to celebrate. So then why are these people celebrating? It's not about abortion itself. It's about that they're tearing down some of these institutions in society, or these moral positions that we've maintained. That's what they seem to be celebrating, because no one would celebrate that you're able to kill babies. That doesn't make sense. So I still reflect on that night, and it's left a very profound sort of image in my head that I'm still trying to make sense of.
Yeah. Well said. Damian, any thoughts yourself on taking action on this?
Look, I think it's about getting the message clear and explaining to people what that means and what is actually. I think anybody who hears that late-term abortion babies are being born alive and then left to die cannot see that as an acceptable state of affairs in any way, shape, or form. So whilst I still remain somewhat confused over the question of early term choice, I'm a sort of a funny one on this, because I have absolutely no question about late term.
Most people don't.
But this is happening. How is this happening in our society?
You're not Robinson Crusoe, because during debates in every state, if the survey is wanting the outcome of support for the bill, they will ask the question, do you support decriminalisation of women? Not a problem. If the survey is honest and wanting to gauge people's feelings about abortion, they will ask a question like, do you support late-term abortion, and sex-selective abortion, and abortion, zero counselling for women? And most people, the overwhelming majority of people, are like you. Whatever position we held previously, for or against, we've got zero tolerance. Most people for this late-term abortion nonsense, which some people say doesn't happen, is a non-event, but it's on the record in the Parliament, in Hansard, and that's a nonsense. Of course it happens. It happens far too often. And what I want to know is if Scott Morrison is going to let this be voted on in the Parliament and seek to make this obvious legislation, because what's wrong with him if not? Like, where's your spine? And the answer to that question is you're his spine. We, the voters, need to speak up with an irresistible, unignorable, not quiet Australian voice, and say, this is what we require from this term of government in Australia, and no less. I mean, there's so much more that I want, so much more, but surely we can achieve this. Surely we can
you would think. And what Robbie said about, the idea that we're celebrating some sort of, when we talk about abortion, we're talking about, pro-choice, that you would celebrate. I mean, there's just something, it's not humane. There's something not quite right with that. Abortion is something that you would do with deep, deep, deep regret, even in the early stages.
And that's true.
Even if you're pro-choice, even if you thought, okay, there's a serious, reason for this, or you don't believe that life begins at the point of conception, or you think it comes slightly later, you still would not be championing or happy that
certainly not the way Jackie Trad was.
I missed that happily.
Robbie was just talking about how there was total breakdown of the normal parliamentary discipline to there being.
I did hear that. Yeah, what he was saying about I didn't realise it was
Jackie Trad, cheerleader in chief of the pro-abortionists,
and the speaker at the time that you were referring to.
I don't know who was the speaker for that. Sorry, Robbie, we'll unmute you. Say again, who was the speaker?
Curtis Pitt from Cairns. Yeah.
Curtis Pitt.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I just we unmuted you, remuted me. I was doubling up on Matt in production over there. Sorry, Matt. Very good. Look, gentlemen, let's wrap the show up. I'll just go around so I haven't left anything unsaid. If there's anything you want to get off your chest, here's your chance. Robbie, you go first.
Yeah, I'm really glad you gave me the opportunity, because I was thinking I'd like to go back to the question on the LNP. I think it's a bit broader than just the LNP. I'm of the very strong view, and you mentioned before being libertarian. I think if you apply that to politics, modern politics, there's a lack of competition in the parliament. So if you're a country politician and you join one of the major parties, you're heavily restricted in how much you can really. There's a bit of window dressing and a bit of posturing in the media that we could cross it, but who's really going to take on that? I think we've been dudded in Australian politics. We've morphed into these two major parties, and I can give you countless examples of where competition breeds better outcomes in the parliament. So if you believe in competition, you believe, I'm happy to debate issues and take policies into that parliament and debate them on their merits, and I'm sure, and I've proven I've got 3 private members bill through that Queensland Parliament, because you can commit, and I'm a country politician. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to brag, but I'm just saying, I respect the Greens' right to be in that Parliament. They should respect my right to be in there.
I agree.
Backbenchers and others should be empowered to follow their conscience, and I think we would all have better longevity to the bills that pass through, so regardless of which party gets through. And I think that's a real problem in modern politics, is that is the diversity in the parliament.
Yep. Damian, final words from you.
Make sure we check out the other side tomorrow.
The other side, Australia, with Damian Coory. Good source got news.
No, I think I've said enough tonight. And it's been a pleasure being here, and lovely to meet David and Robbie, and enjoyed the show immensely.
I love having you on, David, and for all those watching tonight who've liked David Ould's contributions, he has promised me he will come on occasionally. which is generous. David, how would you like to finish up tonight?
I'll just echo Damian's thoughts. It's been a thoroughly stimulating, engaging evening. Thank you, Dave, for the invitation. Let's make it maybe more than occasionally. I think I might want to be here again. I've really enjoyed the conversation, the ability at one point for us to disagree quite clearly on a substantive issue with one of your guests, and yet work hard to find common ground and listen to one another. Gosh, if that happened more often, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Indeed, indeed. Rightio. Well, that's it. Thank you for watching The Good Source. This is a show called Not Q&A because the leftist mainstream media are so constantly in our ears. Yeah. They're still there in this show. We know what they're going to say, but this is the solution to acoustic treatment for the echo chamber, aka the lying harlot media. What we need to empower this, we do not have the market capitalization of $90 billion or whatever it was that you were saying, Robbie, or that Uber has to disrupt the taxi industry. But with the simple democratization of the internet, we're trying to disrupt the lying harlot media. And we would love your help to be part of that. To fight fake news, just head to goodsource.news, click on support, and become a monthly contributor. Make sure you click and subscribe on the emails there. I haven't sent a newsletter for a couple of weeks, sorry, Church and State Conference. But you know what? If you become a supporter, we might be able to get some administration help in the office and keep you up to date a whole lot more regularly, produce more content, and you know, encourage more independent voices to not just write articles, but to also make videos and podcasts to make sure that you have an alternative, honest, and free market solution to the big tech and big media powers in Australia. And a more informed and intelligent voter will hopefully result in a better government and better future for our kids. This is The Good Source, and I'm Dave Pellowe, and we will see you next week. Good night.